All right, so Matt Walsh over at the Daily Wire is back at it again. I guess he might have gotten bored of some of his usual transphobic content and decided to give us an absolutely wild take on the institution of slavery. And we're going to get into this clip here. There's going to be a lot to unpack, but basically he unambiguously makes a pro-slavery argument, at least from the perspective that it was historically necessary in some way, or that we are better off as a society for having slavery in the United States and around the world. So let's just go ahead and jump into this clip real quick.
In fact, it seems rather clear that Black Americans are doing better here today than they would be had their ancestors generations ago never been brought to these shores. We can prove this point by simply asking which African country anyone asking for reparations would prefer to live in. The answer, of course, is none of them.
Okay. Let's take a pause there real quick. Okay, so first of all, understand that he is making this case right now. The entire reason why he's even talking about this subject is to make an anti-reparations argument. Okay, now there's a ton of different things that we could get into in regards to reparations, right? How are you going to decide who gets reparations, who doesn't get it? How are you going to pay for it? What format are you going to go about delivering that? I think that's all fine and good to have conversations around that. I am in favor of reparations in a number of different ways within this country, but understand that he is making this argument to push back against reparations. Okay, so the first part of what he's saying here is that we can demonstrate that slavery was, I guess, a net good for Black Americans at least, because if you were to give them a choice at going back to some African nation, presumably where their ancestors were stolen from, that they would decide to rather stay here in the United States. Okay, so let's think about that just for 1 second here. First of all, many people would have many different opinions on this, right? Some people may want to go back to a different country. There are thousands and thousands of African Americans who have gone back to Africa as a decision that they decided to make. Some people would decide maybe to stay here in the United States for many different reasons. Again, but if you're just going to take this at face value in terms of what the point is that he's trying to make here, right? The point that he's trying to make here is that we in the United States, and therefore Black Americans in the United States, are better off economically, politically, in many different various ways than some African nations that people would presumably be offered to go back to, I guess. Okay, so let's just pause on that. First of all, we're talking about a continent within Africa where we have gone through hundreds and hundreds of years of colonialism that then transitioned into neocolonialism and this global capitalist economic framework that we have around the world to this day. But you want to talk about colonialism, okay? We're talking about hundreds of billions at the minimum, if not trillions of dollars that have been looted from this continent, whether it's in their resources, whether it's in their labor forces, the stealing of human beings and transporting them across the rest of the world to become slaves within these various Western European countries for the most part. We're talking about trillions of dollars that has been looted from this continent over the last couple of hundred years during this era of colonialism. Then we transfer over to this neo-colonialism, sort of capitalist economic framework, where still to this day, African countries are faced with debt traps and all of this different predatory economics that is imposed on them by the same countries, for the most part, who colonized them before, and keeps them impoverished and forces these countries to impose austerity measures on their people, allows US-based corporations or European-based corporations to go in and continue to loot their resources, to continue to exploit their labor forces. So if you want to just have a conversation about why are some African countries economically worse off than the United States right now, well, there's your answer. I mean, that's pretty much what this boils down to. Again, the famous quote here that I would apply to this situation is that Africa is not an underdeveloped continent, it is an overexploited continent. That's just a matter of historical reality. And then we haven't even gotten into the part of the conversation about the political meddling that the United States and other European powers have also engaged in this continent, okay? Every single left-wing socialist leader within the African continent that tried to form some sort of a movement in order to nationalize their resources, in order to democratize their workforces, in order to deliver on material improvements to the people's lives within their own countries, okay, by expelling some of these, US or European-backed corporations or whatever it may be, the United States and our allies have systematically pushed them down. We have either ostracized them in the form of sanctions and blockades, or we have straight up assassinated some of their leaders, like in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I mean, there are so many different examples that we could point to of the United States and our allies economically and politically meddling and fucking with the African continent over the last number of hundreds of years. Okay, so you can't just exclude that as part of the conversation, but he just kind of like glosses over that, and he's like, well, because, you know, the American people are broadly, in a very generalized sense, slightly better off than some African nations, that therefore what, the institution of slavery was justified? I mean, is that the point that he's genuinely trying to make here? But he continues.
Now, you might offer the rebuttal that if slavery never existed, if we're reimagining history without that institution at all, then Africa itself would be in a better shape, better place, and better shape, and maybe indeed Black Americans would be better off there. But this seems highly unlikely, and it also ignores the fact that Africans participated in slavery and the slave trade as much as they were victims of it. Not to mention, if we're reimagining the world without African slavery, then we have to also imagine it without all other forms of global slavery, since African slavery was merely one variety, one offshoot of this global institution. And now we have totally, at that point, rewritten the history of the world in a way so dramatic that it's absolutely impossible to say which individuals today would end up worse or better in this alternate universe. I mean,
you know who would have probably been better off in that kind of a situation? The slaves. I mean, that's a starting point in this conversation. But again, what is he really even saying here? Like, what is the point of what he's saying here? I mean, I agree. Slavery has existed. It wasn't unique just to the United States. I think many historians have made convincing arguments that chattel slavery in the United States was uniquely brutal relative to other forms of slavery throughout history or around the world. That much is probably true. But at the same time, yes, slavery was a global institution. It has been implemented in many different forms against many different groups of people throughout history. But what is your argument here? Are you saying that that was a net positive, that we had all of these different forms of slavery? I mean, in this hypothetical that he's coming up with, he's saying, well, what if we could, you know, push a button and magically erase all of these different forms of slavery throughout human history from existence? And he's somehow indicating that we're better off because we had all of these different forms of slavery without providing any justification for why he even believes that in the first place. But now we get to the end point where he's just going to make an even more laughable argument than what he's even said so far. So let's continue here.
If you go back in time and get rid of slavery from the entire world, you have just, it's impossible to say what the world looks like right now. Actually, what we can say is that we'd all end up worse. All of us today would be in a worse spot if slavery never existed at all across the entire globe.
Okay, so just notice there for a second, right? He goes from saying it would be impossible to understand what the world would look like today if we never had any of these various institutions of slavery throughout global history, right? Okay, that's true. We wouldn't know what the world would look like. That would be a pretty massive shift in global politics and economic development and all of these different things. Sure, we wouldn't know exactly what the world would look like today, but then he turns around in literally the next sentence and insists that he does in fact know that we would all be worse off without those institutions of slavery. So just a direct sentence by sentence contradiction of his own point there. But now he gets to the best part here.
Because a change that significant would likely shift the course of events in a way that would mean none of us would even exist. It would be a world full of other people who are not us. So I know that I benefit today from virtually everything my ancestors did and everything did to them, because if any of that had not happened, there's a very good chance that I never would have come into being. And as I see it, I benefit from being if the other option is not being.
Okay, so that's his, I guess, finishing argument there, at least in this clip. Now, maybe you can go watch the full version of this, and maybe he makes some super convincing point as to why slavery as an institution was necessary here in the United States and around the world, but that end part kind of just boils it down, right? Because he's giving this, like, bizarre individualistic analysis of the situation about, like, broad systemic historical situations that we're trying to analyze here, and he basically just says, okay, effectively, if you were to go back throughout history and remove some of the most atrocious things that human beings have done, that may lead to sort of a butterfly effect down the line where any, number of us, whether it's me or Matt Walsh or you who's watching this video or anybody, may not have existed. Okay. And what is the point there? That because we have every person who happens to be alive today, that justifies all of these other previous atrocities? I mean, you could make this same exact argument about anything, any atrocity that has ever been committed. You could make the same argument about the Holocaust and say that the Holocaust was justified, because if the Holocaust didn't happen and World War II didn't happen and the United States didn't use World War II to become the global dominant superpower around the world, then maybe, I mean, in my personal case, I know for a fact that probably my parents would not have, found each other. Maybe my parents would have never even existed in the first place and been born if it was not for that very specific set of circumstances that led to, my grandparents getting together and having sex at that particular time, and then my parents being born, and then them getting together. My dad came all the way from Australia to the United States, my parents happening to meet in the way that they did, have sex at the exact specific time that they did to produce me as a human being. I mean, like, what is the point here? Okay, because you could make this argument again about anything. So is this a justification for the Holocaust, or colonialism, or any number of other different atrocities, any number of other different genocides throughout history? Because if you were to go back and kill baby Hitler and prevent the Holocaust somehow, that would lead to a different set of people being born in slightly different ways, and then we wouldn't be alive today, and oh, what a tragedy that would be. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like being alive, but at the same time, if you could prevent millions and millions of people from suffering and dying needless deaths, if you had a button that you could push to prevent those atrocities, I think that would probably be justified, and I would have never existed in the first place. Matt Walsh would have never existed in the first place, and that would be what it is. I mean, I would go back to feeling exactly how I felt before I was born, which is to say nothing, because I would have never existed and the world would probably be radically different. But is that an argument for how the world is better off today because you as an individual happen to be the result of all of these complex inner workings around the world that led to the happenstance that led to you being born as a person? I mean, again, what the fuck is the actual argument here? Okay, listen, this is the Daily Wire for you. I would say that the mask has come off, but honestly, at this point, there is no mask. The mask came off a long time ago. Okay, the mask is not coming back. They've thrown the mask on the ground. They've stomped it. Okay, they've completely destroyed the mask. These are just the open arguments that conservatives are making. Some of the biggest conservative political pundits, okay, on some of the biggest independent, so-called independent, political outlets like the Daily Wire, they're just now making open arguments in defense of the institution of slavery. Now, notice how this ties in to the ongoing conversations surrounding things like critical race theory and woke neo-Marxism and all of these other things, right? This is why they want to ban those things from being taught in schools, is because if you have an honest conversation about these things, then you would understand the legacy, okay, of chattel slavery, of the Jim Crow laws, of all of this systemic prosecution, of this systemic discrimination and oppression that certain groups within the United States and around the world have been subjected to. And then maybe if you give an honest analysis of those institutions, then people might guess and might come to the conclusion that maybe we need to rectify that in some way, whether that be through, dramatic investments in Black and brown communities across the United States that have been historically underinvested in, maybe in reparations in one form or another. Okay, that's why he doesn't want those things to be taught in school. That's why Republicans have been waging that war against so-called CRT, or critical race theory, or in other words, honest discussions about the history of the United States and the history of slavery and all of these other various institutions, is because they do not want to have an honest conversation about how we could go about solving some of those problems. Instead, they want to go about having this conversation just by saying this was somehow a moral necessity, or that this was an inevitability, or that if we were to remove these institutions from history, that we would somehow all be worse off for it.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying